Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest secrets hidden beneath the surface. Today we dive into the chilling story of a Canadian pastor whose perfect life unraveled into a nightmare of betrayal and murder. In the small, picturesque town of Maplewood, Canada, Pastor Elijah Grayson was a beloved figure. Known for his charismatic sermons and unwavering dedication to his congregation, he seemed like the epitome of virtue. He lived a quiet life with his wife Nancy and their 5 children, who were the pride of the community. The Grayson family was often seen as the model of faith and unity, with Elijah's gentle demeanor and Nancy's warm hospitality endearing them to everyone they met. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were well-mannered and active in the church, further solidifying the family's reputation as pillars of the town. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence lay a web of secrets that would soon unravel in the most horrifying way. Elijah's father, Harold Grayson, was a reclusive man who rarely visited the town. He lived in a secluded cabin deep in the woods, a place shrouded in mystery and whispered rumors. Harold had always been a distant figure, even during Elijah's childhood. Their relationship was strained, marked by long periods of silence and occasional heated arguments. Few knew the reasons behind their estrangement, but the older townsfolk often spoke in hushed tones about Harold's troubled past. Some claimed he had been involved in shady dealings, while others suggested he had a violent temper that drove people away. Whatever the truth, Harold's presence in Maplewood was minimal, and his sudden appearances were always met with unease. When Harold unexpectedly showed up at Elijah's doorstep one stormy night, it marked the beginning of a chain of events that would shock the community to its core. The rain poured relentlessly, and the wind howled through the trees as Harold stood on the porch, his face shadowed by the dim light of the porch lamp. His arrival was unannounced, and his demeanor was unsettling. He carried with him an air of desperation, his clothes soaked and his eyes wild. Elijah, though visibly uncomfortable, invited him inside, not wanting to cause a scene in front of Nancy and the children. The tension in the house was palpable as Harold settled into the living room, his presence casting a dark shadow over the otherwise warm and welcoming space. Nancy, ever the gracious host, offered him tea, but Harold dismissed her with a curt wave of his hand. His focus was solely on Elijah, and it was clear that his visit was not a social call. The children, sensing the unease, retreated to their rooms, leaving the adults to navigate the awkward and increasingly hostile atmosphere. As the night wore on, Harold's behavior grew more erratic. He spoke in cryptic phrases, his words laced with bitterness and resentment. He accused Elijah of abandoning him, of forgetting his roots and choosing the church over his own flesh and blood. Elijah, though visibly shaken, tried to maintain his composure, urging his father to calm down and speak plainly. But Harold was beyond reason, his anger fueled by years of isolation and perceived neglect. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within the house, and as the hours passed, it became clear that Harold's visit was not just a fleeting moment of familial discord. It was the catalyst for a series of events that would expose the dark underbelly of the Grayson family and shatter the illusion of their perfect life. Little did anyone know, the storm that night was only the beginning of a much larger tempest, one that would leave the town of Maplewood forever changed. Harold's visit was anything but cordial. He demanded money from Elijah, claiming it was his right as a father. His voice was sharp, his tone unyielding, as he insisted that Elijah owed him for years of neglect and abandonment. Elijah, though taken aback by the brazenness of the demand, refused. He explained that the church's finances were not his to control, and that he had a family to provide for. But Harold was not interested in excuses. His eyes burned with a mixture of anger and desperation as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. The argument escalated quickly, the tension in the room thickening with each passing moment. Harold's accusations grew more personal, his words cutting deeper as he dredged up old wounds and unresolved grievances. He mocked Elijah's faith, calling it a facade, and ridiculed his role as a pastor, claiming it was nothing more than a way to hide from his responsibilities. Elijah, though visibly shaken, tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of Harold's words was too much to bear. Then, in a fit of rage, Harold dropped a bombshell. He was not just Elijah's father, but also the biological father of Elijah's 5 children. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt, leaving Elijah momentarily paralyzed. For years, he had believed his wife to be the victim of a random assault that resulted in her pregnancy. Nancy had tearfully confided in him shortly after their wedding, explaining that she had been attacked and that the child she was carrying was not his. Elijah, driven by love and a sense of duty, had stood by her, raising the child as his own. Over the years, they had built a family together, and Elijah had never questioned the paternity of their other children. Now the truth came crashing down around him. Harold's confession was not just a revelation, it was a betrayal of the deepest kind. The man Elijah had spent his life trying to distance himself from, the man he had resented and feared, was not only his father, but also the father of his children. The implications were staggering, and the weight of the truth threatened to crush him. Elijah's mind raced as he tried to process the information. He thought of Nancy, of the secret she had kept from him for so many years. He thought of his children, the 5 lives he had devoted himself to raising, and how they were now tainted by this horrifying truth. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, and it fueled a growing rage within him. Harold, seemingly oblivious to the devastation he had caused, continued to press his demands, his voice growing louder and more insistent. The weight of this truth consumed Elijah. He felt betrayed by both his father and his wife, who had kept the secret for years. The foundation of his life, his faith, and his family had been built on a lie, and the realization left him reeling. As days turned into weeks, Elijah's sermons grew darker, filled with cryptic references to sin and retribution. The congregation noticed the change but attributed it to the stresses of his role. They saw a man grappling with the burdens of leadership, not realizing that their beloved pastor was wrestling with a far more personal and devastating crisis. Little did they know, Elijah was plotting a horrifying act of vengeance. The betrayal he felt was too great to ignore, and the rage that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. He could not forgive Harold for what he had done, nor could he reconcile the truth about his children. The man who had once preached forgiveness and redemption was now consumed by a desire for justice, and his mind began to spiral into darkness. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the town of Maplewood to its core, and the storm that had begun with Harold's visit was far from over. One fateful night, a violent storm swept through Maplewood. The howling wind and pounding rain masked the sounds of what was happening inside Elijah's home. Harold had returned, his presence as unwelcome as it was unexpected. He arrived unannounced, his face twisted with anger and desperation. This time his demands were more aggressive, his threats more explicit. He insisted that Elijah give him money, claiming it was his due for the years of silence and secrecy. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. Harold threatened to expose the family's secret to the entire town, to destroy the life Elijah had built, and humiliate him in front of his congregation. Elijah, who had been simmering with rage since Harold's last visit, could no longer contain his anger. The weight of the betrayal, the lies, and the manipulation had pushed him to his breaking point. As Harold's voice grew louder, his words more venomous, something inside Elijah snapped. The man who had spent his life preaching peace and forgiveness was now consumed by a primal, uncontrollable fury. The confrontation turned physical in an instant. Harold, though older, was no match for Elijah's raw, unbridled rage. The struggle was brutal and chaotic, the two men grappling in the dimly lit living room as the storm raged outside. Furniture was overturned, and the sound of their scuffle was drowned out by the thunder that shook the house. Elijah's hands found Harold's throat, and he squeezed with a force born of years of pent-up resentment and pain. Harold fought back, his eyes wide with shock and fear, but his efforts grew weaker as the life drained from him. When it was over, Elijah stood over his father's lifeless body, his chest heaving and his hands trembling. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, and panic set in. He knew he couldn't let anyone discover the truth. The storm outside provided the perfect cover, and Elijah's mind raced as he formulated a plan. He had to make Harold disappear, to erase any trace of what had happened that night. With meticulous precision, Elijah dismembered Harold's body. His knowledge of anatomy, gleaned from years of studying biblical texts on sacrifice and ritual, proved disturbingly useful. He worked methodically, his movements deliberate and calculated. The storm continued to rage, its fury masking the gruesome task at hand. When the deed was done, Elijah carefully wrapped the remains in heavy-duty garbage bags and loaded them into the trunk of his car. Under the cover of darkness, Elijah drove deep into the woods surrounding Maplewood. The rain had turned the dirt roads into muddy trails, but he navigated them with a grim determination. He chose a remote area, far from any hiking trails or hunting grounds, and buried the remains in a shallow grave. The dense forest and the ongoing storm ensured that no one would stumble upon the site anytime soon. By the time Elijah returned home, the first light of dawn was breaking through the storm clouds. He cleaned the house thoroughly, erasing any evidence of the struggle. The storm had washed away any traces of his journey into the woods, and he felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that he had covered his tracks. But as Elijah stood in the quiet of his home, the weight of his actions began to press down on him. The man who had once preached about morality and redemption had committed an unspeakable act. The storm outside had passed, but the tempest within Elijah was just beginning. He knew that his life would never be the same, and the secret he now carried would haunt him forever. The stage was set for the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade, and the consequences of that fateful night would soon come to light. When Harold was reported missing, the authorities launched an investigation. His reclusive nature meant that it took several days for anyone to notice his absence, but once the alarm was raised, the police began piecing together his last known movements. Suspicion quickly fell on Elijah, given their strained relationship and the fact that Harold had been seen arguing with him shortly before his disappearance. The police arrived at Elijah's home, their questions pointed and their presence unsettling. Elijah, however, was prepared. He maintained a calm demeanor, answering their questions with a practiced ease that belied the turmoil raging within him. He admitted to the argument but claimed it was nothing more than a heated family dispute, one that had ended with Harold storming off into the night. He expressed concern for his father's well-being, even offering to help with the search. His cooperation and apparent sincerity threw the investigators off balance, and they left with no concrete evidence to link him to Harold's disappearance. The police searched Elijah's home and property but found nothing incriminating. Elijah had been meticulous in his cleanup, and the storm had washed away any traces of his late-night journey into the woods. The lack of physical evidence, combined with Elijah's reputation as a respected community leader, made it difficult for the authorities to pursue him as a suspect. For the time being, the case stalled, and Harold's disappearance remained a mystery. Meanwhile, Nancy began to suspect the truth. She had noticed subtle changes in Elijah's behavior in the days following Harold's visit. He was colder, more distant, and his usual warmth had been replaced by a chilling detachment. He spent hours in his study, poring over his Bible and muttering to himself, his sermons taking on a darker, more ominous tone. Nancy also noticed his sudden obsession with cleanliness. as if he were trying to scrub away some invisible stain. One night, unable to shake her growing unease, Nancy followed Elijah as he slipped out of the house. She watched from a distance as he made his way to the edge of the woods, his movements furtive and deliberate. Her heart pounded as she saw him dig up a blood-stained tool from the ground, its metallic glint catching the moonlight. Terrified, she retreated to the house, her mind racing with the implications of what she had seen. When she confronted Elijah, her voice trembling with fear and anger, he dismissed her concerns with a cold indifference. He claimed the tool was from a hunting trip, a story that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Nancy wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. She was torn between her loyalty to her husband and the horrifying realization that he might be capable of something unthinkable. Nancy's unease grew, but she remained silent, fearing the consequences of exposing her husband. She knew that revealing the truth would not only destroy their family, but also shatter the fragile trust of the community. For now, she chose to bury her suspicions. But the weight of her secret gnawed at her, leaving her trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Harold's disappearance grew colder. The police had no leads, and the townsfolk began to speculate about what might have happened to the reclusive old man. Some believed he had simply wandered off and gotten lost in the woods, while others whispered about foul play. Elijah, meanwhile, continued his work as a pastor, his outward calm masking the storm of guilt and paranoia that raged within him. But the truth was not buried deep enough, and the cracks in Elijah's facade were beginning to show. The weight of his actions, combined with Nancy's growing suspicion, created a tension that could not be sustained. The stage was set for the final act of this tragic story, and the secrets that had been hidden in the shadows were about to come to light. Months passed, and the case of Harold's disappearance grew cold. The police had exhausted all leads, and the townsfolk had begun to move on, though whispers of speculation still lingered. Elijah continued his work as a pastor, but the guilt and paranoia that had taken root in his mind began to consume him. He started having vivid nightmares of Harold's dismembered body, the images haunting him both day and night. His sermons, once filled with hope and inspiration, grew increasingly erratic, filled with cryptic references to sin, judgment, and divine retribution. The congregation noticed the change, but they attributed it to the stresses of his role. They saw a man grappling with the burdens of leadership, not realizing that their beloved pastor was wrestling with a far more personal and devastating crisis. Elijah's once steady hands now trembled as he delivered his sermons, and his eyes, once warm and inviting, had taken on a hollow, haunted look. The weight of his secret was crushing him, and it was only a matter of time before it became too much to bear. One Sunday, during a particularly intense service, Elijah stood before his congregation, his face pale and his voice unsteady. The room was silent as he began to speak, his words slow and deliberate at first. But as he continued, his voice grew louder, more frantic, until it seemed as though he were no longer speaking to his flock, but to some unseen force. He spoke of betrayal, of sin, and of the terrible price that must be paid for redemption. Then, in a moment that would forever be etched in the memories of those present, Elijah broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed to the murder of his father, Harold Grayson. He revealed every gruesome detail, from the argument that had sparked the violence to the dismemberment and the burial in the woods. The church erupted in chaos as the congregation struggled to process the horrifying truth. People screamed, some fainted, and others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they were hearing. The police were called, and Elijah was arrested on the spot. He offered no resistance, his face a mask of grim resignation as he was led away in handcuffs. The investigation that followed uncovered the remains of Harold's body, exactly where Elijah had described. The town of Maplewood was left reeling, struggling to reconcile the image of the beloved pastor with the monster he had revealed himself to be. During his trial, Elijah showed no remorse. He claimed that his actions were justified in the eyes of God, a twisted attempt to right the wrongs that had been done to him. The jury, however, saw through his delusions, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Pastor Elijah Grayson remains one of the most chilling in Canadian history, a stark reminder that even the most trusted figures can harbor dark secrets. The town of Maplewood, once a close-knit community bound by faith and trust, was forever changed by the tragedy. The Grayson family, once a symbol of unity and virtue, was left shattered, their lives irrevocably altered by the actions of one man. As for Elijah, he spends his days in a cold, sterile cell, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the weight of his sins. The storm that began with Harold's visit may have passed, but its aftermath continues to ripple through the lives of all who were touched by it. The story of the pastor who dismembered his father serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most seemingly perfect facade.